morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This morning, we're going to have Mark Sham speaking to us. Mark's become a very familiar name within the Sasfin family over the last year or so. He's presented to the staff during lockdown, and more recently, he's partnered us on the Small Business Showcase. For those of you who aren't familiar with Mark, he can be described as a serial entrepreneur, having started numerous businesses before deciding to focus on his Suits for Sneakers project. Today, Mark will be speaking to us about happiness, something we generally take for granted, but over the last 18 months or so has been pretty difficult to find. Mark, over to you.
First of all, just thank you so much for having me. It is always an honor and a privilege. I'm very aware of the fact that we don't have heaps and heaps of time. So what I want to do is before I even just get started, I want to just take you on a quick tour because it's good for you to know what's happening here. So I'm in a studio. So what you're able to see right now is me. This is my wide angle. This is when I want to peer something home at you. I can go full screen with what's going on here, and of course back. And why we do this is in this new world that we're living in, when you have to watch me talk to you from one camera angle where I'm using my webcam and it's pointing up my nose, there's just no place for that. So I wanted to just share this with you so you know what's going on. All right, happiness. So this very broad topic of happiness, I'm so excited to be able to share it with you. And it's something that I've been speaking about for quite some time because I would probably have to say that it is a topic that matters to me more than ever. So, you know, I have been asking myself this question for the longest time. What does happiness look like? And I thought that more people were asking themselves the same question, but it turns out that people necessarily weren't. And I think it's a travesty, to be honest with you. And more importantly, I think that a lot of people right now are obviously bewildered by all things COVID. But the truth is that COVID isn't the thing that's making us unhappy. It's just a symptom of what's going on in our lives. It's not the cause of it. So, sorry, my screen just went. There's a lot going on here at once. So I want to take you down the strip of memory lane, and I want to just give you a reason to care. So there's this book that I read called The Algebra of Happiness, and I would love for you to just take a moment to take note of it. It's a really valuable book, and it's written by a guy called Scott Galloway. In 2019, my life, unbeknownst to me, was going to turn into an absolutely weird place. And I read this book in about March 2019, absolutely loved it. And like I said, I had this crazy year that I didn't know was coming my way. And in the December of 2019, when my life had totally unraveled, there was this video that I watched on a plane connected to the book, and I want to just play a short little snippet for you if I can. It goes like this.
This is a more important metric. For the first time in our country's history, our life expectancy is down 3 years in a row. We're literally dying earlier every year for the last 3 years, mostly because more people will die from opioid overdoses this year than died in the entire Vietnam conflict.
Okay, so what's going on there is that this guy, Scott Galloway, is sharing a little bit about why he wrote this book, and he said something that absolutely blew me away. In the book, in the video, he's talking about this idea that for the last 50 years on average, life expectancy in the US has been going up significantly. In fact, in the last 50 years, they've managed to increase average life expectancy from 60 years to 80. I'm sure you'll agree with me, that is a phenomenal improvement. And he's going on to explain in this video that for the most part over the last 50 years, average life expectancy always went up. The odd year, you would have a slight blip, but for the most part, average life expectancy went up. But in this video, he's talking about this idea that for the last 3 years in a row, at the time, average life expectancy has gone down. And this blew me away when I heard this, to be honest with you, because we live in the greatest era when it comes to medicine and science and technology in general. So why would average life expectancy go down when the reality is that people are indeed living longer? And he says this thing which absolutely blew me away. He says that when you take out things like cancer, right, and these kind of diseases, the leading cause of death where it's created directly by human beings used to be car accidents with about 1 million+ deaths per annum. But he goes on to explain that in the last 3 years, at the time of this video, that car accident was replaced by 2 new leading causes of death. The first being drug and opioid abuse, and the second being suicide. Now, I don't know about you, but this is crazy to me because I speak for a living, and part of what I speak about to people all around the world and businesses all around the world is I talk to them about the fact that the world that we live in right now, it has never been a better time to be alive. And quite literally by the numbers, it has never been a better or easier time to be alive. So you look at this and you think to yourself, how is it possible that more people are pulling the plug on their own lives, which is bringing average life expectancy down? And so it started this really deep investigation on my end. And what I realized was we have a problem in the system. And what I mean by that is, it is indeed true that it has never been a better time to be alive, but it has also never been a more complex time to be alive. And this is before COVID, right? We have more information coming at us. We have more decisions to make. There is just more detail and nuance and development than ever before. So the major break in the system is that up until about 100 years ago, we had very powerful systems that helped prepare us for how the world was going to be in the future. But today, we don't really have that. In fact, I would argue that, I don't know what's going on there for a second. I would argue that today, the systems that we are relying on to prepare us for the future are either grossly outdated or just simply non-existent. So think about it from this perspective, right? What is the point of the schooling system? You would argue that education is the vehicle that we use to help young people gain the necessary skills to be relevant in a future time. But when you actually look at what's going on in the world today, you realize that it certainly equips young people with a certain type of education, but misses out on a totally other side. For example, we go to school to learn math, English, science, geography, history, all of those good things. But what's crazy is that no one teaches us how to be happy at school. And you would argue like, well, what's the point? But I say, isn't the very point to life? Isn't the very reason the point is to get to the end of our lifetimes and look back on our lives and feel like I lived a happy, satisfied, fulfilled life, right? So why is it that no one teaches us how to do that? You could ask yourself a few more questions. Like, look at the many problems that we have in the world today. Take the vaccination program around the world. Look at how polarized people are. Look at how polarized people are around the world because of race, because of politics. Don't you see that one of the big problems that we face in the world today is that no one taught us at school how to have a relationship with other people? Right? Don't you think that's crazy? Like, we didn't get taught that different isn't bad, and we didn't get taught why people are different and how they're different and how we are. And so even in that, we didn't really get taught to have a relationship with ourselves. And we certainly didn't get taught how to have a relationship with pain, right? If you think about it. So I think there's so many things that are needed to thrive in the future, but we didn't get taught those things at school, and our parents didn't get taught those things either. So what you have is broken people raising broken people, but admittedly doing their best. And as a result, you have the most complex version of society we've ever lived in, but no one quite knows how to operate in this crazy world. So this is where the kind of gets the thinking for a happiness workshop and a happiness talk came about. And the most crazy thing that's happened to me in the last, 2 years or so is that the happiness workshop has been the greatest blessing to my own life. And I have learned so much. And that's really where I want to start this off with you, in that I am not a happiness guru. I am simply one human being sharing all the things I've learned with other people. That's it. I am not here in my Jesus robe and sandals pretending that I'm better. I think one of the skill sets that I have is to take large swaths of information and let it roll around in my head for a while and then give it back to people in a way that I guess resonates. And, now we're doing it in this new, crazy and chaotic world. Are you with me? So it's on that note that I kind of want to talk to you about this idea of happiness. So I want to start by saying, I think one of the biggest problems that we have right now in the world is that we don't even see a reason to be able to talk about this topic. What's happened in this world is that we have kind of adopted certain takes on and views on the world from society. And so when people even talk about this topic of happiness, for example, right, people, it gets all weird. It's like, no, I'm happy, I'm fine, as if you have to be broken to go on some kind of happiness training. And I find this quite fascinating because I know if I'm a tennis player, and I want to become better at tennis, I would go and get a coach. I would go and get training. And that makes perfectly logical sense. If I want to learn how to cook, I would go on a few cooking classes, whatever it is. But for some reason, when it comes to like these more esoteric topics in life, but the absolute necessities in life, we do this weird thing where I don't know what it is, we just don't seem to think that we should go for training, or we're like, there's nothing wrong with me, I'm fine. And the question I always ask is, well, don't you think that you can just be a happier version of yourself? The second thing that I want to just put out there before I go run into this is really around the concept of happiness and therapy. In other words, it's not a weakness to go after these things. And I think that we tend to look at it in this way. Okay, anyways, here we go. So the first protocol that I want to talk about when it comes to happiness is I want to talk about this idea of self-awareness, right? And it turns out to me that there's all these things that we didn't get taught about when we were young that, other people, we tend to take for granted. And I think one of them is self-awareness. So I have a very simple attitude. Oopsie, wrong one. Sorry, sometimes get confused with my camera angles. I have a very simple mentality around this thing called self-awareness. It turns out that people think that self-awareness is something that you speak about once when you are young, and then you have it for life. Like it's immediately developed already, and you just go through life without self-awareness. But actually, my argument is that, like common sense, self-awareness isn't so common in the same way that common sense isn't so common in this world. And that's because when we are young, we talk about things like common sense in these big swathing, these like big runs, like, oh, common sense. And we talk about it, and then we think that it's automatically there. But the reality is that that's not true. Self-awareness is actually something that you develop. It's something that you practice, which is why most people don't have it, because self-awareness is one of the hardest things to actually work on. It requires human beings to ask themselves this very difficult, a series of very difficult questions that are actually uncomfortable to answer, that aren't immediately, the answers aren't immediately available because it takes a fair bit of introspection. And it's just not a fun place to go to. And beyond that, I think when people think about the term happiness, they tend to think of the emotion of happiness. But I want to put forward to you today that my version of happiness is much more centered around the idea of a long-form sustainable version of happiness that comes from acquiring the mental and emotional tools to deal with the complexity of life. So what I'm saying to you is that, in a sense, no matter where you live, no matter how old you are, if you are male or female, or you identify as a dustbin, it's irrelevant. Quite literally, I think there are these common denominator practices of things that you can do to become a happier version of yourself, no question. And so when I think about it from that perspective, I think that self-awareness is one of them, because my opinion is as such that you cannot be happy in this world if you cannot first cultivate the practice of self-awareness. And self-awareness isn't something you do once. It is a constant practice where you sit your ass down and you ask yourself these very hard questions, like, who am I? What does happiness look like to me? Am I happy? When someone says these things to me and they hurt me, why? Why do these comments hurt, but these jokes don't? That person offended me the other day. Why? self-awareness is your ability to effectively remove yourself from the emotion and the situation and create this bird's eye view where you're looking down on yourself, almost from a third-person perspective. And you're asking yourself these very difficult questions. But again, as I mentioned, most people don't really want to do these things, right? They'd much rather sit on a couch on a Saturday morning and watch, have a beer and watch the rugby. That's my mates for you. Come to a happiness workshop, not keen. Let's go sit and have a few beers in. And the problem is, like self-awareness, you can often spot when someone doesn't have it. And you can often spot, or someone hasn't developed it, should I say, and you can often spot when someone isn't willing to do the work. And so this is the funny thing, right? I think we keep chasing after the fleeting emotion of happiness, but we don't understand that real happiness is much more a lifestyle and a practice, and it comes down to doing rather than knowing. That is why there is this disconnect between the science of happiness and the practice of happiness. So self-awareness. Self-awareness is the mode, the practice of asking yourself these really deep, introspective, difficult questions. And the truth is, you will always see it in the people who don't want to ask themselves these questions, because you will see that people mindlessly and aimlessly float through life. And I know this because, without sounding like a judgy little knob cheese, I talk to a lot of people. I constantly say to them, like, hey, so what makes you happy? What do you want? And people don't have answers to these things. And when you don't know what you want, you have nothing to aim at. And when you have nothing to aim at, you have no clue if you've hit it, And so this is a lot of how life works, is that you can simply see the difference between the people who are willing to put in the work, which is what makes happiness a practice, and those who aren't. And part of that, quite frankly, is asking yourself these very difficult questions. But I want to kick on to probably the main point that I wanted to leave you with today, because the topic of happiness is so broad. And what I actually end up doing is I've created a workshop for happiness, and it actually lasts a full day. It's like from 9 to 3 p.m. So I've taken all of that and I'm trying to put it into 45 minutes for you. So instead of running through every single thing, I actually want to just leave you with like the main deciding point on how I think you can change your happiness quite a bit. And I really want to talk to you about this concept of storytelling. Right, and I want to just show you how happiness is a choice. Now, we've all heard that, so that's a spoiler alert, but I want to show you what I'm actually talking about from a practical perspective. So there are many things that make human beings unique, but one of them is this incredible ability that we have to collaborate in mass by the billions with other human beings who are complete strangers to us. And the reason we are able to collaborate with strangers who we've never met is actually down to this unique feature of us as human beings, in that human beings are unique and can collaborate in mass because of our unique ability to believe fictitious stories. You with me? Our ability to believe fictitious stories. So I want to show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so go with me on this. Human beings are fascinating, right? We are masterful storytellers. And the thing is, we tell ourselves fictitious stories all the time. We mostly just do it subconsciously. In other words, we are not fully conscious of this idea that we're doing it. So I want to just show you how much of life is actually a story and a decision and a perspective. Okay, and that's why I think happiness is a choice. Because actually, how I could run today is I could tell you this very simple thing. I could say to you that there is a direct correlation between your level of happiness in your life and the quality of the stories that you tell yourself in your head about the world, and you can tell yourself any story. But of course, people don't like that very much. So I'm going to kind of just show you how we naturally believe fictitious stories and how malleable life really is. So I want to take you back to this concept of what we call a new year. Think about it, right? Go with me in that. Go back to 2018, the 1st of January, and I want you to think of how many people got to the 1st of January 2018 and they made a life-changing New Year's resolution. Now, I don't want to talk about the people who didn't stick to it. I want to talk about all the people who did. Right? There must be several million people around the world who got to the 1st of January, made a life-changing New Year's resolution like, I'm going to quit smoking, I'm going to lose weight, I'm going to change careers, I'm going to get divorced, I'm going to get married. Are you with me? They made these life-changing, I'm going to move countries, whatever it is. Now imagine all these people who made this decision and actually stuck to it. Just to show you the power of a story, go with me on this. if you realize that time in itself is just a construct, it's just a story, right? Somewhere along the line, you go back a few thousand years ago and man started to observe that the earth rotated around the sun, and it took about 1 year or one story called a year to do this. And human beings are epic at labeling things. And so what we do is we say, there's this thing called a year. A year is 365 days. Within a year, there are 12 calendar months. You know the drill. And we do all of these things where we create labels. So we said to the world, in this year, there are these 12 calendar months, and the first year is called January, and the last year is called this, and the last month is called December, right? And it only becomes truthful because everybody believes it. So what's amazing is that when a new year comes around, right, it's not like God himself actually comes down on the 31st of December, just before the stroke of midnight, and says, ding, ding, hey guys, good go, let's try again, rings a bell, and off we are into the new year. It's not how it is at all. So it's really just a man-made construct. So let's go back to the New Year's resolution that millions of people around the world made on the 1st of January 2018. Don't you find it fascinating that these people had to wait until the 1st of January to get to this point where they could make a life-changing decision? Right? I mean, what stopped them from doing it on the 27th of August or the 15th of June the previous year? And the answer is technically nothing, but there is such power in a story when we all buy into it. And almost all humans around the world buy into the story of what we call a new year. And it becomes, even though it's fictitious, it becomes so real because so many people buy into the same story. So it just shows you, if for nothing else, that we are absolutely storytelling machines, right? We believe in these constructs, these fictitious stories. So time, in a sense, right, is a fictitious story, but there are many other fictitious stories that we buy into. Take the story of money, right? It is indeed true that money is just a story. It's not real. But what makes it real is our ability as human beings to really believe it. So I know this because money is a fictitious story, but it's so real because it enables me to collaborate in mass with other people. Right? Money is the concept that allows me to go down the road from this office, and then it enables me to give a stranger a printed piece of paper. And as a result, she allows me to literally walk out of the grocery store having never met me. She doesn't know who I am, but we both believe in the same story, that this printed piece of paper has an inherent value. And I know this to be true, to be a story, because you don't see chimpanzees swapping bananas for printed pieces of paper, right? They don't have that ability to believe a fictitious story, but we absolutely do. So I know that money is just a story in reality, because in South Africa, we believe in the story called the Rand, but I was living in the UK for 18 months, and there they totally believe a different story called the pound. And if you were to take Rands into their grocery store, try hand it to that lady who also doesn't know you, she just simply doesn't believe the same story you believe. And if you think about it, money, the story of money, is really backed up by the story of the bank, right? A bank is just a story, and banks really give life to these other stories called companies. And I know that companies are truly stories because you can't actually shake the hand of Sasfin, nor can you shake the hand of Suits and Sneakers. Both of these entities are just stories, but the power lies in our ability to believe fictitious stories. And we all agree that companies are real. That's why we go to the CIPC and we sign a piece of paper, which becomes legally binding. And now suddenly, Suits and Sneakers Pty Limited becomes a real life entity. And we know that it is a real life entity because banks actually treat companies as if they are as real as people. And we know this to be true because if I default on something as Suits and Sneakers Pty Limited and I'm not negligent, the actual truth is that banks and governments won't come after Mark Sham, even though Mark Sham 100% owns Suits and Sneakers, but they'll come after Suits and Sneakers directly because Suits and Sneakers is treated as a real entity. And I find that to be so amazing, right? Because you actually quite literally can't shake the hands of Suits and Sneakers. You absolutely can shake the hand of Mark Sham, but both are treated as equally real with separate and unified rights. But it just shows you how powerful storytelling is, because in reality, we just believe these stories. And my favorite part about this is that even countries are stories, right? The story that is South Africa is quite literally just a story. In the 1960s, South Africa used a currency called the pound. And then one day we were like, no, that story is done now. We're just going to start using a new story called the rand. And I know that countries do a very similar thing, because up until not too long ago, the country of Zimbabwe was called Rhodesia. And then one day we were like, no, just kidding. The story called Rhodesia, it's over now. So if we can just get all of you to now buy into the story that is called, Zimbabwe. So we do this all the time. We chop and change our stories, but they become as real as anything simply because enough people buy into these stories. And so what I'm always trying to explain to people is that we are quite literally masterful storytellers as human beings, and that the quality of our stories quite literally dictates the quality of our lives. And the craziest part is that we can believe any story. We already subconsciously do. So, I think that the spoiler alert of today is that happiness is a choice. But of course, that is very cliched, right? I mean, that could kind of be the end of my happiness workshop if we wanted to, but it needs a little bit more of depth. And so why I believe that happiness is a choice effectively is because we have the choice to believe any story we want. So if I go back there for a second, right, you've got to understand quite simply that human beings are masterful storytellers. And we can tell ourselves any story. So I want to share with you for a second some of the stories that I used to believe that I stopped believing, because that's the power that we have as human beings. So here's one, for example. For the longest time, I grew up believing a story that if I didn't get a university degree, I wasn't worth anything. And I cannot tell you how long I believed the story. And I was doing very well academically up until my matric year, and then I got kicked out of school. It's a very long story. And indirectly, that occasion changed my entire life. But what was interesting is it took me so long to disregard the story of you are only valuable if you have a university degree. Now, I'm not anti-degrees, but I think there are many forms of education. Formal is just one of them. And I've actually managed to teach myself about the world informally. YouTube, podcasts, books, events, seminars, TED Talks, you name it. And although you don't get degrees every time you consume this kind of informal learning, over time, if you make it a habit and you become a self-directed continuous learner, you become very powerful. You become informally educated. And I know this to be true because people with awesome degrees work for me. And I'm not saying that they're less than me. I'm just showing you how crazy it is that, value is relative. Value is equally just a story. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you here is this, is that happiness is indeed a choice, but here's a key point to understand. And that is that most of the stories that govern how we see the world aren't actually ours. Okay? Go with me on this. Most of the stories that dictate how we perceive the world around us aren't ours. What happened was when we were young, we were influenced by society, our parents, right, the world at large. And the world told us these stories, right? So the world said indirectly, ladies, you're only a lady if you act like this. Men, big boys don't cry. University degree is good, anything else is bad. And most of this was well-meaning, right? The world wanted you to get a university degree because you were probably better for having one than not. But we started to believe these fictitious stories equally. They're not even our stories. They were just inherited by us from the world around us. But they become so ingrained in us that eventually we simply mark them as true. And I find that part to be the most amazing part, because they aren't necessarily true. They're just stories, and we have the ability to either latch onto a story or let go of it. So let me give you one as a perfect example. For the longest time, the world believed a story that more recently we're not starting to believe anymore. And that was, if you're a man and you like other men, you should be murdered, right? We thought of people who liked the same sex as evil and inherently bad. But where did we get the story from, right? Without going into that too much. But it's not true. So around the world, a movement has started where people who are gay and lesbian, etc., are now accepted as normal. But there are still 60 countries around the world, give or take, that believe the story that if you are homosexual, you are bad. I can go one further. Ladies, for the longest time, we believed that women were inferior to men. That's why, for the longest time, we didn't even allow women to vote. And in fact, that story became so normal that women even believed it. In our country, in South Africa, we believed the story that people of color were quite literally less than people who are white, right? Like me. And for the longest time, this is the way we ran this country. It was so normal, it was passed into law. And even laws are stories, right? Because sometimes I question why we believe certain laws. You know, the more I mature in life, and the more I start to look at the world and ask myself these deep introspective questions. I have to ask myself, like, is the law the gold standard? Because, you know, apartheid was law. Hitler and Nazism was law. Do you know what I mean? Killing homosexual people just because they like other, you know, the same sex was law. And so you start to realize that these are malleable stories, and I don't always have to buy all the stories that are around in the world. So when you think about it like that, you start to just question other stories in your life. So like I said to you, one of them was, but is this working for me, this idea that, you know, if I don't have a degree, I'm invaluable? Well, the irony now is that I get paid by companies like yours to help those companies reimagine their learning journeys in the workplace. And I don't even have a matric. And I find it to be quite fascinating, because it shows you that value is just a story and it is malleable. I'll give you another one, and then I'm going to kind of kick on, which is the concept, I guess, of, sorry, I'm looking at the screen there for a second. Oh yes, that's right, money. So double backing to money. One of the stories that I inherited from my parents, and it's not like they said this to me, it's just that they taught me this through their actions, was that money is the root of all evil. Now, again, it's a very weird story, but it was their story for the longest time. It kind of still is to a degree. But for me, I realized that I was constantly poor because I believed that story. And then one day I had this point I had this moment where I started to think, but is this story true? And is this story benefiting me? And when you start to realize that stories are malleable and that you can put old ones away and you can literally latch onto new ones, it's quite incredible what comes about. So once I started to see money, or once I started to tell myself the story that money is actually just energy, it's oxygen that you can use to create with, right? And specifically in a business sense, money is important in that you need oxygen to breathe. Or let's think of money like petrol, right? Money is petrol that you put into a car. So cars, in order to drive around, need petrol. Companies need money, but you don't drive around collecting more petrol. You actually drive the car somewhere specific. And that's where I started to understand that businesses, for me, are vehicles for change, right? Vehicles for value creation. And that money is inherently good in this instance, because money is the petrol that I put into the car that allows me to drive to point A to point B to create change and to create value. And it's funny, right? Because as I started to change my narrative on money and the story around money, and as my container started to grow, suddenly I started to make more money. And I find this to be fascinating, because I can still see it sometimes with my parents, where they struggle with this concept, and so they constantly remain in debt. And it's not this is not about me making it sound like I'm Moneybags McGee. That's not the point. But the point is that I quite literally have seen my container grow, which has helped me to hold more money. And it all came from a story that I told myself in my head about the world. So, when I say that, for example, when I say that happiness is quite literally a choice, I mean it. let's maneuver on. I want to talk about habits very quickly, because it turns out that better habits lead to better outcomes in your life, right? You are effectively the person that you practice to be every day. So a lot of people ask me, well, how do I become a happier version of myself? And I often say to people, well, first you have to understand the concept of stories. And to understand stories, you have to have self-awareness. And once you kind of have meditated and interrogated those two, then you can kind of come back to this idea of habits. Because it turns out that better habits lead to better outcomes in your life, no question. But I've had to learn this the hard way, because I've come from a really shitty background, and I've had really terrible habits that I've had to unlearn. And when you have to unlearn something or anything, it is actually the unlearning and the unlatching of an old story. That's what you're doing. You are effectively letting go of an old story and believing a new one. But of course, that is easier said than done. Okay? So let's go back there for a second. Habits. And what I want to do is I want to introduce probably one of the greatest habits known to humankind in the form of sleep. So it turns out that one of the greatest habits you can really work on to become a happier version of yourself is sleep. And that's quite simply because we are biological, physiological creatures. But just to illustrate the importance of stories, the problem why most people don't prioritize their sleep is because the story they believe in the world today is that where we glorify the hustle porn culture. We believe the story that if we are not constantly on the move, constantly on the go, and if we are not constantly working on something all the time, then we are not productive. And so we also tell ourselves the inverse story, that taking time to rest and to slow down isn't valuable. And so you can see it in people's attitudes toward rest and sleep. We glorify being on the go the whole time, and then we burn out because it's simply unsustainable to move at that pace. But it's not that we don't know how to prioritize our sleep. It's quite simply that we don't prioritize it because of a story that is rolling around in our heads about rest. Are you with me? So sleep is a big one. But I can tell you, for example, that food and exercise is a big one. Now, I want you to look at that guy right with the underneath the arrow. That is 11-year-old Mark Sham. And just look at him. Every time I look at this picture, I feel for him, this guy. That guy, wow, I'm looking at it here on my screen. That guy was 90 kilograms at 11, and he had a broken story with food and with exercise. And, you know, I look at that poor guy back then, and I realized that so much of what he needed to be taught in the world wasn't taught to him, right? So you just wing it. So there I am. I come out of the womb, very disconnected from my parents, always longing for that intimate family connection, but never having it. And so you start to soothe and numb with food. Every time I feel bad, I eat food. And so that's how you, I mean, it's not a shock how you get to like 90 kilograms at 11. So there I am doing my thing, and I start to numb with food. And then I start to feel out from the world. And so I eat even more. It becomes this repetitive cycle. And then what starts to happen is I get to about 13 or 14, and now you start to take liking to girls, but you don't fit in because the world doesn't like fat little kids, right? And so now I start to lose the weight, but I start to find other things to replace food for validation. And so you get into this really messy cycle. And without the guidance and the help, it can turn into a real mess. But more recently, in the last 10 years or so, but specifically in the last 3, I have really discovered my deep passion for training and eating cleaner food. And don't get me wrong, I love a good burger. I love pizza. I love a good glass of beer. I mean, a beer or a glass of champagne or wine or what have you. But I've learned to have a much more healthier relationship with food and with exercise, because I've started to change my narrative and my story in my head. And I've started to see the value of self-discipline. And I've started to see the value of going to gym every day because it makes me a better version of myself, even though most mornings I wake up and I don't feel like going to gym. Right? And I started to realize there's this beautiful system called you pay now or you pay later. It turns out that everything in life comes at a cost. Going to gym this morning came at a cost. I didn't want to. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. I'm still getting used to this new little machine we have down here. So I woke up this morning, I don't feel like going to gym. But the problem is, as I've also learned, another powerful story that I've had to unwind is that we tend to wait for motivation to do things. So a new story that's coming to my head is that action actually creates motivation, not the other way around. And so now I wake up this morning, I don't feel like going to gym, but if I don't go this morning, I'm going to pay for it later because I'm going to feel crap about myself. And I've come to learn that the feeling of lack of self-esteem is way more expensive than the price of the uncomfort that I have to pay to go to gym this morning. But before, I used to believe a broken story that if I didn't go to the gym this morning, I'd secretly managed to skip it. I'd cut the corner and no one knew. But all I was doing was cutting myself off. Are you with me? So this is really fascinating, the things that I've had to learn about stories and narratives. But people often say to me, so like, what are the best habits that I can then get into? And I'm like, it's all the habits that you know. If you prioritize your sleep, you are a better version of yourself. And if you exercise and clean up your diet and you put these three as a trifecta, your life will change. But it's not that you don't know that. It's that you most likely have outdated stories and ingrained crappy habits in your life that are dictating that you feel and act the way you act. You know, I'm learning that it's actually not hard to get into shape. You just wake up, go to gym every day and eat clean for 6 months or a year, no problem. The issue isn't knowing what to do. It's actually taking the action and becoming the type of person that wakes up every single morning and goes to gym even when they don't feel like it. And what I've come to learn is that most of why we do or don't do what we do is because of outdated stories and narratives that are running in our head. And most of those are subconscious because we haven't cultivated self-awareness, right, to ask ourselves these very deep questions. Does that make sense? So I hope, I'm really trying to take a large swath of information and put it down. Let's very quickly talk about value creation. What I've seen in my life for sure is that if people want to be happy, they have to learn how to create value for others. But for some reason, we didn't get taught the art of value creation at school. We actually only got taught, we didn't even get taught about business or even money, but thank God for Pythagoras, quite literally. There's all these things that are missing. But the one I really want to just touch on for 2 seconds is value creation. I believe that human beings were fundamentally built to create value for others. And I know this because I'm always trying to spend my time with high value people. And people who are of high value are effectively people who create high levels of value for other people. Now, I'm human like everybody else. I don't always get it right. But in the pursuit of value creation, I've seen that when I create value for other people, it does something to me. It has an impact on me. And I don't think we were taught this novel art of value creation. And so a lot of people come to me and say, well, then what's the trick to happiness? And I'm like, I'll give you one. It's, there's no silver bullet to happiness. There are many complicated things that have to come together. But one of them is study value creation. Become a high value person. Easy to understand, hard to do. Creating value means you play the long-term game, you seek to create value for others, and in turn, you will feel valued by others. That's it. But there's a disconnect between the value you create and where you feel valued by, because it takes a while for society to cotton on to the value of value creation, because it's, again, like the hustle porn culture, the go, go, go mentality that we constantly glorify. We tend to sometimes glorify these characters who take shortcuts. Anyways, value creation. I can tell you for sure that if you were to practice the art of value creation and make it a priority to seek and create value for other people, over time, you would become a very valued person in society. And this yin and yang system of creating value and feeling valued by would ultimately lead to you feeling like you matter, which would ultimately lead toward happiness. Second last one. I think one of the big problems is that most people are unhappy in this world quite simply because they don't know what they want. But let me tell you, people can tell you what they don't want. And I know this because I speak to people all the time. I say to them, hey, who are you? What do you do? Are you happy? And most people can't answer. They don't know what makes them happy. And the test for this is, hey, if I took away all your immediate costs, I gave you universal basic income, your basic needs were met, right? Not elaborate, but basic needs. You didn't have to work to eat or to put a roof over your head, for electricity or for the internet. You could sit your ass down for 6 months or a year and just survive. What would you do with your time? What is the problem you'd solve for other people? Truth is, most people don't know. People can't tell you. And I'm not saying there's a problem with knowing what you don't want. There's definitely a place for, I don't want this and I don't want that. The problem more lies in that people don't know what they do want, and they haven't taken the time to figure it out. And they haven't done that because they haven't learned how to experiment. And most of why we don't know how to experiment is because we'll do anything to avoid pain or failure. And it really brings me to my last point, is that one of the greatest challenges facing society today is that we have not learned how to have a relationship with pain. And it's quite ironic that we don't have a relationship with pain, because it turns out there's nothing we can actually do to avoid pain in our lives. In fact, you can be a perfectionist and COVID could have still come to hurt you through no fault of your own. But more specifically, it actually turns out that pain is our greatest driver for growth if we choose. But the problem is that we're too busy trying to do anything to avoid pain. And when we feel it, we will do anything to numb it. And I can just speak for my own life. I am chief front and center of doing that type of thing. I'm always trying to avoid or numb pain, at least in my 20s. And so I had to learn this very hard lesson over the last 10 years to not avoid pain, but actually, if you want to heal, you have to feel. Again, as soon as you say something like that, society says, ooh, that sounds very cliched. I know what that sounds like. I'm out here. But the reality is that those stories are broken. You know, big boys don't cry. I wrote an article about it about 3 days ago. I said, you know, this is hurting us as men. This idea that you have to be strong all the time, you can never express yourself, just put up a brave face. It's hurting us. And because we don't want to have a relationship with pain, we get stuck in a rut and then we become bitter. So I know that if people were to have studied the subject of relationship with pain from the 1st to the 12th grade, if we learned to have a relationship with other people and we studied it as a subject from the 1st to the 12th grade, if we even learned to have a relationship with ourselves, right, from the 1st to the 12th grade, we would be so much better for having done so. But the problem is that we quite literally didn't do these things. And so what we have now in the world today is people chasing after external bouts of happiness. We are looking for all these other things, cars, money, relationships, all these things outside of us to make us happy. And they have fleeting moments of giving us, I guess, a happiness rush. But the truth is that happiness actually comes down to acquiring the mental and emotional tools that help you deal with the complexity of life. It is all these little things that we fundamentally label as soft skills, when what they should actually be called in life is core skills. And I know for sure that if people were to take the time to encapsulate these practices and take them on head on, that no matter who you are, where you were born, what gender you are, how old you are, that there are these certain common denominator practices that if you were to even do just for a short space in time, that you would become a literal better version of yourself. It would lead to a long form, sustainable version of happiness. But society doesn't value these things, right? We will pay $3.5 grand for a seat at a training workshop for Excel, but we don't value a happiness workshop yet. And yet the thing that we absolutely need is not just the hard skill of Excel training. We need to be taught how to be happy, because it turns out that all human beings are just winging it. And there are broken people raising broken people, and we simply don't have it figured out. And yet there's all this information that tells us quite literally how to be happy. Here's the thing. I'm trying to take so many broad topics and put it into a tiny little space for you. So I actually want to make an offer to the people watching this in Sasfin, if you can help me with this. I've actually got a happiness workshop taking place here at my venue here next week, Saturday, the 11th of September. And what I'd like to do is they normally go for 2,000 Rand a seat. But I thought long and hard about this. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to offer 10 seats at no cost. Right? I would like to offer, I don't know how we're going to pick it, choose it, but if you're in the Johannesburg area, I would love to give you a seat. It's worth 2,000 Rand. First come, first serve on the 10 seats. You have to be able to come to my venue in person here in Johannesburg next week, Saturday, the 11th of September. But I'd like to offer that to you as my act of value creation in this world. I really want to say thank you so much, guys, for giving me the gap and the opportunity to share this topic with you. It's a very short space of time because we had about 45, 50 minutes, but I hope you've really been challenged to think, and I hope I've lit a little fire up your ass, so to speak. That's it from me. I wish you nothing but health and love and, of course, happiness. That's it.
Okay, Mark, thank you so much for that. Truly inspiring, and a few things did stick with me. The fact that the bank is just a story is something that I'm sure Mark will be very happy to hear that. But yeah, and the other thing was the stories that dictate how we see the world are not ours. I think that is just so true, and something we do need to bear in mind. For all of you that have attended today, you should have received a little parcel with some bread and a spread, and that is literally, it's Spring Day. We want you to spread the happiness, so go out there and do it. We will be, with regards to the very generous offer from Mark, I'll be chatting to marketing about how we can do this. Possibly, send an email to those of you who have attended, and then probably do a lucky draw. We just need to work out how we're going to do it. But thanks to everyone for your time. Really appreciate it. Mark, your pearls of wisdom. Once again, I've listened to you a number of times, and you never disappoint. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, guys.